We are back. Peanut Gallery, take it away.
All right. So I actually have it on my phone now because I'm not a colossal idiot. And yeah, so we're going to talk about the Japanese concept of God. So, when the English word God is translated into Japanese, it is generally represented by the kanji pronounced as kami. However, to avoid misunderstanding, it would be better to think of God and kami as three separate concepts. So, God is the supreme being of monotheism and is customarily capitalized to indicate the unique nature of the deity and to draw a distinction with the multiple gods of polytheism. The written Japanese form of God is influenced by the Chinese meaning of the character. Common words in both languages using this character, such as the word pronounced as Seleshin in Japanese, meaning spirit or mind, and the Japanese word Shinkai, meaning nerves, are related to the human mental qualities. Pronounced sh in Japanese, the character carries some divine attributes, but those are decidedly low rank and far below those of the highest power in Chinese theology, termed xian or shangdi in Chinese. I'm pretty sure I'm getting the pronunciations okay, but I'm pretty sure I'm inflecting it totally wrong.
Right.
Because you know how Japanese is and Chinese is.
Right. It's about the inflection. Right.
Right.
After a while, you'll kind of get used to it as you're watching more New Japan. You're not as cultured as I am.
Anyways, Japan's kami were traditionally thought of as anthropomorphized natural phenomena. They include the kami that appeared in the Kojiki, Record of Ancient Matters, and Nihon Shoki, Chronicle of Japan.
I swear to God, you're saying like the worst words in the world because you're not like saying it correctly.
Japan's ancient records of myth and history, kami, or that were worshipped in shrines, and everything possessing extraordinary qualities, including the sun, the moon, the wind, the rain, the sea, large rocks and trees, and even some smaller plants, animals, and people. This is how they were defined by the 18th century scholar of Japanese classics, Motori Norinaga. According to Motori, anything that inspired awe and sensitivity to the ephemeral body was a kami. For Japanese people who believe this, their country is a rich natural landscape with kami to be found wherever they turn. In short, a kami no kuni, country of kami, if the phrase is translated into English as God's country, can be misunderstood as a fanatically nationalistic expression. But this is not what the phrase actually means. Japan's traditional faith based on worship of the kami is known as Shinto. There are no records to show what it was like in ancient times, and many details are unclear. We cannot even say there is a set of beliefs and rituals that sufficiently unified what we would call them Shinto. It is likely that the religion came into being as a blend of different elements, such as weapons, families of gods, rulers, festivals. The Japanese began to think of these elements together as Shinto after Buddhism spread to Japan, and they compared the new religion with their traditional practices. So, I guess what I was trying to get at is the Japanese people are, by and large, either Shinto or Buddhist in their beliefs. Now, if you know a little bit about Buddhism, Buddhism doesn't believe in the God concept that we would associate with God today. So, at the very end of the day, the Japanese concept of God is, and this is another problem with translation, is that one word doesn't totally mean another. But what we ascribe to as God, the Japanese would ascribe to a particular set of attributes that can be assigned to everything from nature to living humans. In fact, in Japanese culture, the emperor and their family is seen as living gods, which is part of the reason why you saw such fanaticism towards that Japanese Shinto belief about emperor gods really strong in Japan during World War II, was because that was a very strong belief among the military at the time, that the emperor was actually divine, like the Egyptians of the past believed and stuff like that. So, when Kota Ibushi, for example, referred to himself as a wrestling god, he wasn't talking about God in the way that we as Westerners would associate with as God. What he was talking about was he was possessing a certain number of qualities that made him in attribute-wise made him above and beyond those of what they would term mere mortals. Like, there was something about Kota Ibushi that was just intrinsically better. So that's kind of where that concept of wrestling, that's kind of the concept of where wrestling God came from, is that he was referring to the ability of that wrestler to perfect, to be the embodiment of perfection of that craft.
Now, another thing that I noticed, and I'm sorry for interrupting, because you said wrestling god, and JBL called himself a wrestling god.
But he was referring to himself in a different context.
Right, because he was an American who wrestled on American shows predominantly.
And he was also portraying a heel.
Right.
And so when he portrayed a heel, of course, he used that as sort of an arrogant stance by saying that he was superior, he was better than everybody else. It has nothing to do with the abilities that JBL had. Like, what Kota Ibushi is referring to is the ability, because according to Japanese lore, the word kami, which is what most people use to translate as God, was more seen as an attribute,
right?
As possessing a set of attributes that set them apart,
right?
Kind of like how someone have kami, like in warrior lore, or something like that. Like, they would consider them a god of war.
Right.
Or, something along those lines. And that actually is very common, too, especially in Japan, because the Japanese people still practice ancestor worship.
Right.
And so legions in the past, and this still does exist to an extent, would actually revere and pay homage and everything to certain generals that they revered, because they saw them as gods of war.
In a way, the god attribute, and if I'm not mistaken, it's very, very similar to folk heroes that we know of now, or demigods in ancient Greece, where there is human attributes, like Hercules.
Right.
Hercules was a human, but he also had...
He possessed godlike attributes.
Because his father was a god.
Right.
So, I mean, I understand it, because I did see a lot of those comments, and it's like, okay, well, what about JBL? He called himself a wrestling god. His was in a different context than what it is, because of where not only was he wrestling in, the audience getting that information was going to be different.
Right.
Now, if it was a heel, that heel would probably call himself a pro wrestling god in the context of them being a god.
Context of the Western tradition.
Right.
But in the Japanese tradition, remember too that we were also getting a translation. And so if you looked at the translation, they were talking about the attributes of
Right.
God. They were not talking about like the actual people. And I understand there are a lot of Christians and stuff now in Japan, but remember, we're talking about Japanese culture.
Right.
We're not necessarily talking about what the individuals believe. We're talking about, in Japan, wrestling is a tradition.
Right. So think about it like this: if this was in the American style in an American show,
right,
they would be
like Kota Ibushi would have been top heel, saying that,
right,
I am.
No, in the context of them calling a god in there,
right,
it would be equivalent to the American version of calling a babyface like a living legend.
Right.
It's literally the same context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're possessing the qualities. So that's a very good analogy to make. So when someone refers to themselves in Japan as God, think about someone
living
in America
legend
calling themselves a living legend. Right. So that's kind of what I have. Let me know what your thoughts are, and when we come back from break, wrestling lessons with Tiger Height.
Absolutely.